Hello again, welcome to Social Psychology, Psychology 346, and today we're going to be talking about some of the foundational theories of social psychology. So in talking about social psychology, there are a lot of different influences that the situation can have on why a person feels the way they do, thinks the way they do, and behaves the way they do. One such example is what's called the fundamental attribution error, and this is pretty much how we understand motivations for behaviors of other people. If a person runs a red light driving around, we can either think, wow, that guy's an asshole, he just ran a red light, what a jerk. Or maybe we can think about the situational constraints that the individual might have, such as, well, maybe someone in the car is about to have the baby and they're trying to get to the hospital. So we can have completely different attributions of a person's behavior. I'm thinking about different motivations that a person can have given the situation or given our natural tendencies. Another example is construal level, and this is basically the way we perceive the world around us. The adage perception is reality has a lot of truth to it. So one example of this idea that perception is reality is kind of modifying a game known as the prisoner's dilemma. In this game, you can either cooperate with a partner in order to receive a reduced jail time sentence for performing a bad deed, or you can dissent against your partner and possibly receive no jail time at all, or if the other person dissents against you as well, you receive a maximum amount of jail time. But where we see some interesting differences is how this game is framed. When it's framed as the community game rather than the prisoner's dilemma, we see a lot more cooperation. Whereas when the game is framed as the Wall Street game, we see a lot more dissension and a lot more competition. So simply framing or phrasing the game in a completely different way leads to completely different behaviors. Again, modifying the situation to change the way we behave and think about certain things. And people enter different situations with their own expectations. So for example, if you're walking along the street and an attractive member of the opposite sex smiles at you, what might you initially think? Well, you might think, hey, all right, they might like me, they might be attracted to me. That could be one way of interpreting that smile. Another way would be, well, maybe they just saw something funny. Maybe they're looking at me and they think that I'm funny, so they're smiling at me. Another interpretation is maybe they're just simply in a good mood and they're not really smiling because of something, but they're just smiling because they're generally happy. And we may, given our expectations of their smile, given our own personal tendencies, can interpret the exact same behavior in very different ways. Another way we interpret the world around us is through what are known as schemas. And these are basically an organized body of stored information about any given situation. They basically give us information about how we should think, feel, and behave in certain situations. And oftentimes, these schemas facilitate our own behaviors in these situations. There are so many different stimuli, so many different things in any given situation that we could look at. It's just way too much information to pay attention to. So we have these schemas that help us navigate certain situations that we may encounter on a frequent basis to help us basically get to business and do what we want to do, not be bogged down by paying attention to every little thing. So for example, when we enter a classroom, we have schemas about how we should behave. We should sit in one of the desks that are in the classroom. We should face the blackboard or the whiteboard because that's where the professor is going to be. And we should generally try and pay attention in class and not disturb people. We may have or form schemas for completely new environments. So we may understand that as, say, for example, if you're a Seattle Seahawks fan, if you enter a room that has a lot of Seahawks paraphernalia in it, you may boast about the Seahawks and talk a lot of Seahawks talk. But if you enter a room that has a lot of San Francisco 49ers gear in it, you may not talk about Seattle Seahawks. You know the appropriate way to behave in these situations, and schemas help us to do this. Whereas schemas help us navigate situations, stereotypes often help us interact with other people. They're basically personal schemas or schemas about groups of individuals. And these are intended to facilitate interactions, make these interactions as fluid and helpful as possible. They generally help us interact with certain groups of people or certain types of people that we have underlying knowledge about in some way, shape, or form. So we may have knowledge about how geeks typically behave or what they typically talk about, and knowledge about how nerds typically behave or what they typically talk about. So we can bring up certain topics with them that might facilitate easy conversation and may help us have good interactions with them and avoid certain topics that maybe they are not familiar with. So these are ways in which stereotypes can be used for good, but as we'll talk about later in the quarter, stereotypes can also be used for evil. Additionally, we can talk about what are known as channel factors. And these are factors about daily life that people don't necessarily think are important, but are actually extremely important when we make decisions about daily life situations, etc. So for example, we may have specific intentions about how we should behave in a given situation, but these intentions don't necessarily transfer into behaviors unless these channel factors are met. So for example, we may not visit a doctor unless we're a certain distance from a healthcare provider. Additionally, we see that persuasion is a very important technique that we're going to be talking about this quarter. And people can abuse these unknown persuasion techniques or unknown perceptions that we have to help them convince people to do what they want them to do. So for example, we are extremely influenced by patriotic ideals, and a lot of the war propaganda that existed in World War I and World War II played on these patriotic beliefs that people may not necessarily didn't know that they had, and encouraged them to help fight in the war effort. Additionally, we'll spend a lot of time this quarter talking about the differences between automatic and controlled processing. We've already mentioned some of the automatic processes that occur, considering being influenced by things that we might not be explicitly aware of. These differences between automatic and controlled processing can also parallel differences between emotional decision-making and rational decision-making, and also parallel differences between implicit and explicit attitudes. So these are differences between the beliefs and attitudes that we know that we have about certain objects and the beliefs and attitudes that either we might not know or beliefs and attitudes that we might not willingly share with other people. So for example, we might say that we like apples more than chocolate, but truthfully, implicitly, we actually do like chocolate more than apples. And oftentimes we can see that these implicit and explicit attitudes don't necessarily match one another. These combinations can be incompatible, and they can also have negative implications. We may be very poor at decision making if we believe we have a specific attitude about an object, but in actuality our true feelings about that object are completely different. Additionally, when talking about stereotypes that we've already mentioned, they can sometimes be automatically activated without our knowledge or awareness. And these can influence our thoughts and behaviors after that. It can lead to prejudice and discrimination, unfortunately. And generally, when we talk about implicit attitudes or automatic or unconscious, uncontrolled processing, we generally see that it's extremely efficient and can influence us in ways that we could not possibly be aware of. So sometimes we're unaware of why we do the things we do. Sometimes we're unaware of certain stimuli that might influence our thoughts and behaviors. So for example, one study found that when people read stories about the elderly, they tended to walk slower than people who did not read stories about the elderly. So these subtle influences can really influence how we behave in the real world. And additionally, we can see something known as embodied cognition. That means the way we actually move and kind of function in the world can influence how we think about things. So for example, if we push up on a table compared to pushing down on the table can influence how we feel about certain things. Or extending our arm out versus pulling things towards us can influence how we feel about other objects. So if we bring an object closer to us, we feel more connected to it than if we physically push it away from us. All right, that's all we have today. We'll continue talking about this in not too long, but thank you for your time and attention, and I will see you later. Bye.